The October rain beat gently against the windows of the luxurious department store Magnolia & Co. in downtown Charlotte, North Carolina. It was a typical autumn Thursday, and foot traffic was lighter than usual. Behind the jewelry counter, Madison Parker nervously adjusted her perfectly straightened blonde hair, checking her reflection in the glass of one of the display cases. At 22, Madison considered herself the most successful employee in the store. A Duke University marketing graduate, she had landed the job through family connections. Her father was a minority partner in the company. For Madison, this job was merely a stepping stone to something bigger, a way to gain experience until she could secure a position at a major New York corporation. She carefully observed every customer who entered, mentally categorizing them into serious buyers and just looking. It was a skill she had developed over her 2 years working there, and she was rarely wrong. Serious buyers wore designer clothes, drove expensive cars, and spoke with the confidence of those accustomed to having money. The others she treated with forced politeness, hoping they would leave soon. The door chime rang softly as a black woman of about 60 entered the store. She wore a simple brown coat, slightly damp from the rain, comfortable but inexpensive shoes, and carried a leather handbag that, while well-maintained, showed signs of wear. Her graying hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and she walked with the upright posture of someone who carried natural dignity. Dolores Jordan paused for a moment at the entrance, gently shaking raindrops from her coat. Her brown eyes swept the environment with respectful curiosity, admiring the elegant decor and displayed products. She had spent her entire life teaching her children the value of hard work and humility, but that didn't mean she couldn't appreciate beautiful things. Madison observed the woman's entrance with the experienced eye of someone who had served thousands of customers. The simple coat, practical shoes, worn handbag, all signs pointed to the just looking category. She sighed discreetly, hoping the visit would be brief. Dolores walked slowly through the aisles, occasionally stopping to admire a piece of clothing or accessory. She didn't touch anything, merely observed with the respect of someone who understood she was in an environment where everything had its place and value. There was something in her posture that spoke of a life dedicated to caring for others, of hands that knew both hard work and gentle affection. When she finally approached the jewelry counter, Dolores smiled warmly at Madison. It was a genuine smile, the kind born from natural kindness and decades of cultivating true human relationships. "Good afternoon, dear," Dolores said in a melodious voice that carried the soft accent of the South. "What a beautiful place you have here. I'm looking for something special for my daughter-in-law's anniversary. She's always been very good to me, and I thought I'd surprise her with something elegant." Madison forced a professional smile but couldn't completely hide the condescending tone in her voice. "Of course, ma'am. What price range were you thinking?" The question was phrased politely, but there was an implicit suggestion behind it. Madison was clearly trying to direct Dolores toward the cheaper items, to avoid what she assumed would be an embarrassing situation. Dolores didn't seem to notice the tone, or if she did, chose to ignore it. Madison raised an eyebrow almost imperceptibly. It was always the same thing, people who clearly didn't have money pretending they could afford expensive items. She had seen this dozens of times. Customers who wasted her time, and that of other employees, trying on products they could never buy, just to feed their fantasies. "Well," Madison said, her patience already beginning to wear thin, "we have some interesting options in the fine costume jewelry section. They're very beautiful pieces, with more accessible prices." Dolores tilted her head slightly, a gesture Madison interpreted as confirmation of her suspicions. In reality, Dolores was simply processing what she had just heard, trying to understand why she was being immediately directed to the cheapest items without even having expressed a preference. "Actually," Dolores said softly, "I was interested in that set over there." She pointed to a display case containing diamond necklaces and earrings, clearly in the 5-figure range. Madison followed Dolores's gaze and felt a mixture of irritation and amusement. There it was again, a customer clearly without financial means, pointing to the most expensive pieces in the store. She could already imagine what would come next. The woman would ask to see the jewelry, waste 20 minutes of her time, asking questions, then make up some excuse about needing to think about it more before leaving empty-handed. Those pieces are from our premium collection, Madison explained, making no move to open the display case. The set you're looking at costs $12,000. She pronounced the amount slowly, expecting to see Dolores back down. Instead, the older woman nodded thoughtfully. That's a considerable amount, Dolores admitted. But as I said, my daughter-in-law means a lot to me. May I take a closer look? Madison hesitated. It was store policy to allow customers to examine any item, but she also knew her supervisor didn't like it when employees wasted time with tourists who had no real intention of buying. She looked around the store, noting there were other customers who seemed more promising. Of course, she finally said, with an almost audible sigh. But I need to make it clear that these are very delicate pieces. So, I'll have to ask you to be very careful. The condescending tone was now impossible to ignore. Madison was treating Dolores like a child who needed supervision, and other people in the store began to notice the interaction. Dolores felt a pang of sadness, not for herself, but for the young employee. She had spent decades working with people from all backgrounds and knew how to recognize prejudice when she saw it. Still, she maintained her dignity and politeness. Of course, dear, I understand completely. Madison opened the display case with deliberately slow movements, as if she were doing an enormous favor. She removed the diamond necklace and placed it on a velvet cloth on the counter, but became clearly uncomfortable when Dolores extended her hand to examine it. Perhaps it would be better if you just looked, Madison suggested. The oils from skin can damage the metal. It was a flimsy excuse. Jewelry was made to be worn, and any quality piece could be easily cleaned. But Madison was determined to minimize the risk of what she saw as a no-win situation. Dolores politely lowered her hands, but there was growing sadness in her eyes. Not because of how she was being treated, but because she recognized in this young woman a lost soul, someone who had allowed prejudice and superficiality to obscure her humanity. It really is beautiful, Dolores said sincerely, admiring the craftsmanship. The quality is exceptional. Madison nodded impatiently, clearly wanting to end the interaction. Yes, it's one of our most special pieces. As I said, it costs $12,000, plus taxes. There was something in her voice that suggested she doubted Dolores even knew how much that amount was. It was subtle arrogance, but unmistakable. I understand, Dolores said. And how much for the matching earrings? Another $8,000, Madison replied automatically, not even trying to hide her irritation. Ma'am, I don't want to sound rude, but I have other customers to attend to. If you'd like to see something in a more realistic price range, I can show you some very beautiful options that cost a few $100s. 2. It was at this moment that Madison's mask of politeness finally slipped completely. Her suggestion wasn't made with tact or consideration. It was a clear attempt to dismiss a customer she judged unworthy of her time. Dolores remained silent for a moment, processing not just the words, but the poorly disguised contempt behind them. She had faced prejudice before. Of course, she had grown up in the South during a much more difficult time, but it always surprised her when she encountered it in unexpected places. I understand your concern, Dolores finally said, her voice maintaining the same sweetness as before. But I'm really interested in these pieces. As I said, they're for someone very special. Madison let out a low chuckle, which was intended to sound professional but came across as clearly condescending. Ma'am, I've worked here for 2 years. Believe me, I know when someone is just dreaming. There's nothing wrong with that. We all like to imagine having beautiful things, but these pieces are a serious investment, and I really need to use my time with customers who are ready to make a real purchase. The silence that followed was tense. Other customers in the store stopped talking, sensing that something important was happening, even without fully understanding what it was. Dolores looked at Madison for a long moment, seeing beyond the superficial arrogance to the insecurity and emptiness that fed it. She thought of her children, especially Michael, and how she had worked her entire life to teach them that a person's value had nothing to do with their bank account or the car they drove. "Dear," Dolores said softly, "may I ask your name?" "Madison," the young woman replied, slightly confused by the change in conversation direction. "Madison," Dolores repeated, as if savoring the name. "That's a beautiful name. Tell me, Madison, what do you see when you look at me?" The question caught Madison off guard. She blinked several times, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden intimacy of the conversation. I don't understand what you mean. I. It's a simple question," Dolores continued, her voice still gentle but with an underlying firmness. "When I entered this store, before I even opened my mouth, you had already decided who I was and what I could afford. Am I right?" Madison felt her face flush. She knew she had been caught, but her arrogance was greater than her ability to admit error. "Ma'am, I just try to be realistic. There's nothing wrong with guiding customers to products suitable for their profile. Victor's 50. That's I makes night. Profile," Dolores repeated slowly. "And what profile would that be?" "Exactly." The store had become completely quiet now. Even the other employees stopped pretending they weren't paying attention. There was something in Dolores's calm dignity that commanded respect, a presence that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Madison realized she had gotten herself into a situation from which she didn't know how to escape. Her university education hadn't prepared her for this moment to be confronted with her own prejudiced attitudes by someone who maintained absolute composure in the face of discrimination. I wasn't trying to offend," she stammered. It's just that you looked at me and saw someone who didn't deserve your best service." Dolores finished for her, still without a trace of anger in her voice. "Someone whose money wasn't as green as other customers." Madison opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. Because deep down, she knew Dolores was absolutely right. "Well," Dolores said, picking up her purse and preparing to leave, "I suppose I'll take my business elsewhere. But before I go, I want you to know something, Madison." She paused, looking directly into the young woman's eyes. "A person's real value has nothing to do with their appearance or their clothes. It has to do with how they treat others, especially those they think are inferior to them. And in that regard, dear, you are poorer than anyone I've ever met." With those words, Dolores Jordan turned and walked toward the door, her posture still upright and dignified. But as she walked, she discreetly took her cell phone from her purse and made a call. "Michael," she said softly, "it's Mom. Do you have a few minutes? I just had an interesting experience I'd like to share with you." On the other side of the line, Michael Jordan, who was in a business meeting in his Hornets office, immediately detected something different in his mother's voice. In all his years as a professional athlete and businessman, he had never ignored a call from Dolores, and he wasn't going to start now. "Of course, Mom. What happened?" As Dolores left the store and began telling her story, Madison remained paralyzed behind the counter, still holding the diamond necklace. She had no idea that she had just triggered a series of events that would be remembered far beyond the walls of that store. Outside, the rain had stopped, and a golden ray of sunlight began to break through the clouds, illuminating the figure of a woman who had spent her life teaching her children that true wealth couldn't be measured in dollars, but in character. And now, one of those children was about to show the world what he had learned from those lessons. The storm was just beginning. Michael Jordan put the phone on speaker and gestured for his assistants to leave the conference room. When the door closed, he leaned back in his leather chair and focused completely on the familiar voice that had been his moral compass throughout his life. "Tell me everything, Mom," he said, his voice carrying the same tenderness he used when he was a hurt child running to her arms. Dolores described the incident with the precision of someone accustomed to teaching. After all, she had been a teacher for decades before becoming known as Michael Jordan's mother. She didn't embellish or dramatize. She simply reported the facts with the honesty that had always characterized her relationship with her children. And what saddened me most, she concluded, wasn't how she treated me, but the person she's allowing anger and prejudice to transform her into. This young woman, Madison, has so much life ahead of her. It would be a tragedy if she continued down this path. Michael closed his eyes as he absorbed every word. At 59, he had accumulated more wealth and recognition than he had ever imagined possible when he was a child growing up in Wilmington, North Carolina. But all the achievements, all the trophies, and all the billion-dollar contracts paled in comparison to the lessons he had learned sitting at the kitchen table, listening to his mother talk about dignity, respect, and the intrinsic value of every human being. "How are you feeling now, Mom?" Michael asked, though he already knew the answer. Dolores Jordan wasn't the type of person who let herself be defeated by others' ignorance. "I'm fine, dear. I really am. But I keep thinking about that young woman. Someone taught her to see the world this way, or perhaps no one bothered to teach her to see differently. Either way, there's an opportunity here, an opportunity for education, for growth, to show that there's a better way to live." Michael smiled, even knowing his mother couldn't see him. It was so typical of Dolores to transform a negative experience into a potential lesson, to find hope where others would see only disappointment. "What do you have in mind?" "Honestly, nothing specific yet. But you know how I've always taught you, when someone shows you who they really are, you have a choice. You can react the same way, or you can show who you really are." Michael stood and walked to his office window, which offered a panoramic view of Charlotte. Below, people from all backgrounds walked the streets, each carrying their own stories, struggles, and triumphs. Some, like that store employee, were trapped in cycles of judgment and prejudice. Others, like his mother, had learned that true strength came from compassion. "Do you have the name of the store?" "Magnolia & Co. And the girl's name is Madison Parker." "But Michael," Dolores paused, "whatever you do, do it with love, not with anger or revenge. Anger never taught anyone to be better." Michael nodded, even knowing she couldn't see him. This was the mother who had raised him, always pushing her children to be better, always finding ways to transform challenges into opportunities for growth. "I understand, Mom. Leave it to me." After he hung up, Michael stood for several minutes, looking out the window and processing what he had heard. His first reaction was anger, a hot, protective rage that made his jaw clench. Nobody treated his mother that way. Nobody. But then he heard Dolores's voice again in his mind. "Do it with love, not with anger or revenge." He remembered a conversation they had had years before, when he was still playing and had gotten involved in a controversy with a reporter who had made disrespectful comments about his family. "Michael," she had said at the time, "anyone can retaliate. Anyone can give back in kind. But how many people can transform a negative moment into something that really matters? How many people can use their position and influence to plant seeds of real change?" Now, decades later, facing a similar situation, he understood exactly what he needed to do. Michael picked up the phone and called his executive assistant. "Sarah, I need you to get me some information about a store called Magnolia & Co. Owners, employees, financial history, everything you can find. And I need this information by the end of the day." "Of course, Mr. Jordan. May I ask why?" "I'm considering an investment opportunity," he said, which was technically true, though not the kind Sarah imagined. While his assistant worked, Michael made some calls of his own. First to Marcus, his personal attorney, then to David, his accountant, and finally to Patricia, one of the executives at his foundation. "Patricia, I need you to help me with a special project," he said when she answered. "Something related to education and customer service training. It's for a department store, and I want to create something truly transformational." "What kind of budget are we considering?" "Money isn't an issue. The goal is to create a program that can be replicated elsewhere. I want to show how proper diversity and inclusion training can transform not just a business, but the people who work in it. Patricia, who had worked with Michael on dozens of philanthropic projects, immediately recognized the tone in his voice. It was the same tone he used when he was truly inspired, when he had found a cause that touched his heart. I'll start working on this immediately. How much time do we have? I want everything ready by next week. And Patricia? This project is personal. Very personal. After the calls, Michael allowed himself a few moments of quiet to fully process what his mother had experienced. He thought about all the times she had sacrificed her own desires to support his and his siblings' dreams. He remembered the nights she worked late to ensure clothes were clean and meals were ready. He thought about how she always found money for sports equipment, even when finances were tight. More importantly, he remembered the lessons, the endless conversations about character, about treating all people with respect, about never letting success make him forget where he came from. Dolores hadn't just created one of the greatest athletes in history. She had created a man who understood his responsibilities to others. Sarah returned with the requested information earlier than expected. Magnolia & Co. was a mid-sized family business, founded 3 generations ago. It was currently facing some financial difficulties due to competition from large chains and online sales. The Parker family, yes, employee Madison, was the daughter of the minority partner held a 30% stake in the business. Michael smiled as he read the report. The pieces were starting to fall into place. His next call was to the store's majority owner, a man named Harold Magnolia, grandson of the founder. Mr. Magnolia? This is Michael Jordan. I'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss a possible business partnership. There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by nervous stammering. Michael Jordan? The Michael Jordan? Yes, sir. I'm interested in your business, and I believe I may have some ideas that would be mutually beneficial. Of course. When would be convenient for you? How about tomorrow morning? And Mr. Magnolia? I'd like all your employees to be present. I have some plans that involve the entire team. 9. 9. 9. 9. 9. 9. 9. 9. 9. 9. When Michael hung up, he felt energized in a way he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't the energy of competition or business, it was something deeper. It was the energy that came from knowing he was about to honor the values his mother had spent her life teaching. He picked up the phone one more time and called Dolores. Mom? It's me. I wanted you to know. I found my opportunity. I'm going to do something special. Something that honors everything you taught me. I'm sure you will, dear. But remember. I know. Michael interrupted gently. With love. Always. With love. Exactly. And Michael? I'm proud of you. Not for what you've achieved, but for the man you've become. When he hung up, Michael looked out the window again. Somewhere out there, a young employee named Madison Parker was finishing another day of work, unaware that her life was about to change forever. And somewhere else, Dolores Jordan was probably preparing dinner, transforming yet another negative experience into a life lesson. Tomorrow would be a new day, full of possibilities. And Michael Jordan, son, former athlete, and businessman, was ready to show the world what he had learned about true greatness, sitting at the kitchen table, listening to his mother talk about the importance of treating every person with dignity and respect. The lesson was about to begin. Madison Parker came home that night with a strange knot in her stomach that she couldn't explain. Her one-bedroom apartment in Myers Park, partially paid for by her family, normally made her feel accomplished, a symbol of her independence and success. But today, the walls seemed to echo the words of an older woman she had treated poorly. She tried to distract herself with her usual evening routine: a hot bath, a glass of white wine, and some mindless television that didn't require much thought. But the image of Dolores Jordan, though Madison didn't know her name, kept returning to her mind. A person's real value has nothing to do with their appearance or their clothes. Madison shook her head, trying to push away the words. The woman didn't understand how the real world worked. In luxury retail, there were expectations and realities. You didn't waste time with customers who clearly couldn't afford the products. It was simple business logic. At least, that's what she kept telling herself. But then why did she feel so disturbed? She grabbed her laptop and began browsing social media, seeking the digital validation that always made her feel better. Her photos from her last trip to Miami already had hundreds of likes, and the comments were full of praise for her appearance and lifestyle. This should have made her feel better. But today, it felt empty. Madison replayed the interaction in more detail. The woman had been polite, respectful, and even kind when confronted with disrespectful treatment. There was something in her posture and manner of speaking that suggested, "What? Class? Dignity? No," Madison murmured to herself. She was just trying to make herself seem more important than she really was. But even as she thought this, another part of her mind questioned her own motivations. Why had she automatically assumed the woman couldn't afford the jewelry? Just because of her simple clothes and age? Madison remembered other similar interactions over the past 2 years. How many customers had she judged and treated differently based on appearances? The difference was that none of them had directly confronted her behavior. None had held a mirror to her face and forced her to see her own reflection. The phone rang, interrupting her reflections. It was her father. "Hi, Dad," she answered, grateful for the distraction. "Madison, sweetheart. How was work today?" It was a question he asked almost every day, and she usually responded with stories about big sales or interesting customers. Today, she hesitated. "It was interesting. I had a somewhat unusual customer." "How so?" Madison found herself telling the story, but realized she was modifying the details as she spoke. In her version, the customer had been difficult and demanding, not polite and dignified. She portrayed herself as professional and patient, not condescending and prejudiced. Her father listened attentively and then offered the kind of advice she expected. "You did the right thing, sweetheart. You can't waste time with people who aren't serious buyers. Time is money in retail." His words should have validated Madison's actions, but instead, she felt even worse. She had lied to her own father about what had happened. And why? Because somewhere, deep down, she knew her actions had been wrong. After hanging up, Madison stood in her living room, looking at her reflection in the dark window. Who was the person looking back at her? She had grown up in a comfortable family, attended good schools, and had opportunities many people would never have. Her parents had always emphasized the importance of education and success, but somewhere along the way, she had confused material success with personal worth. Madison remembered college, a business ethics course she had taken in her sophomore year. The professor had talked about unconscious bias and how our perceptions are shaped by prejudices we don't always recognize. At the time, she had taken diligent notes and earned a good grade on the exam, but had never really applied those lessons to her own life. Now, for the first time, she began to question her own attitudes and behaviors. How many times had she judged people based on appearances? How many opportunities for genuine human connection had she lost by being too focused on categorizing and classifying? The night dragged on, and Madison found herself unable to relax. She tried to read, but the words blurred on the page. She tried watching television, but couldn't concentrate. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that woman's face not with anger or resentment, but with a deep, understanding sadness that was somehow much worse. The person she's allowing anger and prejudice to transform her into. Had that been what the woman said? That Madison was transforming into someone lesser due to her prejudices? Around midnight, Madison finally admitted to herself the truth she had been avoiding all day. She had treated a good person badly. She had allowed her own insecurities and prejudices to dictate her behavior, and in the process, had become exactly the type of person she had always criticized. Superficial, judgmental, and cruel. The realization hit her like a punch to the stomach. She collapsed on her bed, feeling an emotional weight she had never experienced before. It wasn't just guilt for what she had done. It was the terrible recognition that her actions reflected something deeply wrong with her worldview. Madison began to cry, not tears of self-pity, but tears of genuine shame and regret. She thought about her education, all the opportunities she had received, all the privileges she had taken for granted, and she had used all of that to justify treating another person as inferior. When she finally managed to stop crying, Madison sat up in bed and made a decision. She didn't know the woman's name or how to find her, but somehow she would find a way to apologize. More importantly, she would find a way to become a better person. She had no idea that the next morning, her opportunity for redemption would arrive in a form she could never have imagined. Meanwhile, in a modest but cozy house on the other side of town, Dolores Jordan was finishing her nightly prayers. As always, she included a special prayer for people she had encountered during the day, including a young store employee who was clearly lost and in need of guidance. "Bless that young woman, Madison," she whispered. "Help her find her way back to the goodness I know exists in her heart." Dolores didn't know that her son Michael was at that moment in his office, working late to finalize plans that would transform his mother's prayer into reality. She didn't know that within a few hours, the lives of everyone involved in that store incident would change forever. All she knew was that she had planted a seed of consciousness in a young soul, and now it was up to the universe and that young woman's choices to determine whether that seed would grow. At Magnolia & Co., the jewelry displays gleamed silently in the darkness, waiting for another day of commerce. But tomorrow would be different from all the days that came before. The storm was forming, but it would be a storm of transformation, not destruction. And at the center of it all would be a lesson about the true nature of wealth, dignity, and human redemption. Harold Magnolia arrived at the store 2 hours earlier than normal, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the front door. At 62, he had run the family business for nearly 3 decades, but had never received a call like yesterday's. Michael Jordan wanted to meet with him. The Michael Jordan. Harold had spent the entire night trying to imagine what one of North Carolina's wealthiest men could want with his department store that, frankly, was struggling to remain relevant in the age of online commerce. His hopes oscillated between fantasy. Perhaps Jordan wanted to make a large purchase for his family. And terror. Perhaps there was some legal problem he was unaware of. He had called all the employees the previous evening, asking them to arrive early for a special meeting. Most responded with curiosity and enthusiasm. It wasn't every day they had a meeting with a celebrity. Madison, however, had seemed strange on the phone, almost reluctant. When Madison arrived at the store, Harold immediately noticed something was different. She normally dressed with the confidence of someone who knew exactly how she wanted to be perceived. Elegant clothes, perfect makeup, assertive posture. Today, however, she seemed smaller somehow, less sure of herself. "Are you okay, Madison?" Harold asked gently. He had always had a special fondness for her. Not just because she was his partner's daughter, but because he saw great potential in her intelligence and energy. "I'm fine, Mr. Magnolia. Just thoughtful." Harold was about to ask more when other employees began arriving. Soon, the store was full of nervous conversation and speculation about what Michael Jordan could want. Some suggested he was looking for gifts for his family. Others wondered if he was considering opening his own retail store. Only Madison remained silent, a growing knot in her stomach. She had spent the night reflecting on her actions from the previous day, and the coincidence of Michael Jordan appearing today seemed surreal. Surely it was just that, a coincidence. There couldn't be any possible connection between Charlotte's most famous man and the older woman she had treated poorly. Or could there? At 9 o'clock sharp, a black limousine stopped in front of the store. Michael Jordan emerged from the back seat, wearing an impeccably tailored dark blue suit that cost more than most employees' monthly salaries. But it wasn't his appearance that was impressive, it was his presence. Even at 59, he commanded attention in a way that transcended fame or wealth. Harold rushed to open the door, his hands sweating slightly. "Mr. Jordan, it's an honor to have you here." Michael shook the older man's hand firmly, his smile genuine but reserved. "Thank you for receiving me on such short notice, Mr. Magnolia. And please, call me Michael." When Michael entered the store, his eyes quickly scanned the environment, noting the employees gathered near the central counter. His expression remained neutral and professional, but internally, he was cataloging every face, searching for one specific young employee. He found her standing slightly behind the others, and something in her posture, the way she held her arms, the way she avoided direct eye contact, immediately told him that Madison Parker was feeling uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort was sometimes the first step toward change. "Please," Michael said, addressing the group. "I'd like everyone to gather around. I have some important things to discuss." The employees moved closer in a semicircle, their faces a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. Harold stood beside Michael, clearly trying to project an image of professional partnership, though he still didn't know what that partnership would be. "First," Michael began, his voice carrying the natural authority of someone accustomed to leading, "I want you to know that I'm here for personal reasons, very personal ones." He paused, letting his words settle. Madison felt her heart racing. There was something in his tone that made her deeply uncomfortable. "Yesterday," Michael continued, "someone very important to me had an experience in this store. An experience that made me reflect on business, on customer service, and more importantly, on how we treat each other as human beings." The silence in the store was absolute. Madison felt as if her legs might give out at any moment. It couldn't be. It was impossible. Yesterday's woman couldn't have any connection to Michael Jordan. "This person," Michael said, his eyes now moving deliberately through the group until they landed directly on Madison, "was treated in a way that doesn't align with the values any respectable business should maintain." Madison felt the blood drain from her face. The other employees began looking around, trying to understand what situation Michael was talking about. But Madison knew. Oh God, she knew, exactly. "Mr. Jordan," Harold interrupted nervously, "if there was any problem with our service, I'd like to know immediately so we can correct it." Michael nodded. "And that's exactly why I'm here, Harold. To correct the situation." He moved a few steps closer to the group, his presence completely dominating the space. "The person who was mistreated here yesterday was my mother." The words fell like a bomb into the store's silence. Madison felt the world spinning around her. Her colleagues turned to look at her, understanding and horror dawning on their faces as they connected the dots. Your mother?" Harold stammered, confusion and panic competing in his expression. "Dolores Jordan. A 61-year-old woman who worked as a teacher for decades, who raised 5 children with dignity and grace, and who yesterday was treated as if she were unworthy to breathe the same air as this store's employees." Michael's voice remained calm, but there was an intensity underneath that made each word cut like a blade. Madison opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She wanted to run, wanted to disappear, wanted to be anywhere except there, facing the consequences of her actions. But her legs wouldn't move. "Mr. Jordan," she finally managed to whisper. I didn't know." "Didn't know what?" Michael asked, his voice still controlled, but with a sharp edge. "Didn't know she was my mother? And does that matter? Does the fact that you didn't know who she was make the treatment she received any less unacceptable?" Madison shook her head, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "No, I mean, let me ask some questions," Michael said, addressing not just Madison but all the employees present. "When you see a customer enter this store, what criteria do you use to determine how much time and attention that person deserves?" Silence. "And when you decide someone probably can't afford something, What do you base that decision on? Mynoth. More silence, because from what my mother told me, she was immediately directed to the cheapest pieces, treated with condescension, and eventually told she was just dreaming when she expressed interest in higher-value jewelry. Harold looked at Madison with growing horror. As the owner, he knew this type of behavior not only violated basic customer service policies but could also result in serious legal consequences. Madison, he said, his voice trembling. Is this true? Madison knew the moment of truth had arrived. She could try to minimize it, make excuses, or shift the blame. Or she could finally take responsibility for her actions. Yes, she whispered, her voice barely audible. It's true. The admission brought an even deeper silence. Her co-workers looked at her with a mixture of shock and disappointment. Some had suspected that Madison sometimes treated customers differently based on appearances, but they never imagined she would be so flagrantly discriminatory. Michael studied Madison's face for a long moment. He could see genuine remorse in her eyes, as well as fear. Good. Fear meant she was beginning to understand the gravity of her actions. Madison Parker, he said, his voice now softer but no less intense. Daughter of Robert Parker, marketing graduate from Duke University, employed at this store for 2 years. Madison blinked in surprise. How did he know so much about her? You're 22 years old, Michael continued. Still very young. Young enough to learn and grow. Young enough to change. He paused, letting his words sink in. The question is, do you want to change? Everyone in the store was looking at Madison now, waiting for her answer. She felt as if she were in a courtroom, being judged not just for her actions, but for her fundamental character. She began, her voice breaking. We start with honesty, Michael said firmly. Complete honesty. Tell me exactly what happened yesterday, without edits, without justifications, just the truth. And then Madison did something she hadn't done since she was a small child confronted by her parents after doing something wrong. She told the complete truth, all of it, without trying to make herself look better or minimize her actions. Every condescending word, every prejudiced assumption, every moment of arrogance. She exposed it all. When she finished, she was crying openly. Not from self-pity, but from genuine shame for what she had become. Michael observed her for a long moment, seeing beyond the surface to something deeper. There was potential there, he realized. His mother was right, this young woman was lost. But she wasn't beyond redemption. Thank you for your honesty, he said finally. Now, let's talk about what happens next. He turned to Harold. I have a proposal for you, Harold. One that will benefit not just your business, but everyone who works in it. Harold nodded eagerly, still in shock from what he had just heard. I want to invest in your store. I want to bring it into the 21st century, make it a model of excellence in customer service and inclusion. But there are conditions. Anything, Harold said quickly. First condition. All employees will undergo intensive training in diversity, inclusion, and customer service. Not just a one-day seminar, but a real, transformative program. Harold nodded vigorously. Second condition, Michael said, his eyes returning to Madison. This program will be led by someone who personally understands what it means to be judged by appearances. Someone who can speak to both the dangers of prejudice and the power of redemption. Madison looked at him through her tears, confused. You, Madison, will spend the next 6 months learning what exceptional customer service really means. You'll work with diversity experts, volunteer at community organizations, and learn about the experiences of people from different backgrounds. He paused. And then, if you prove you've truly changed, you'll become this store's training coordinator. You'll teach other employees the lessons you've learned. Madison looked at him in shock. You're not going to fire me? Firing you would be easy, Michael said. Anyone can fire someone. But transforming a person, helping them become better, that's much more difficult and much more valuable. He moved closer to her, his voice becoming gentler. My mother said something yesterday that has stayed with me. She said you have so much life ahead of you, and it would be a tragedy if you continued down this path. Well, Madison Parker, here's your chance to choose a different path. For the first time since he had entered the store, Michael smiled. It was a smile that carried both challenge and hope. The question is, are you ready to do the work? Madison looked around the store at her colleagues, at her boss, at the man who was offering her a second chance she knew she didn't deserve. And then, for the first time in a long time, she made a decision based not on what was easy, but on what was right. Yes, she said, her voice firmer than it had been all day. I'm ready. Michael nodded. Then let's begin. Today. What none of them knew was that this conversation was being discreetly recorded by the store's security cameras, and that within a few hours, with permission from all parties involved, parts of this transformation would be shared with the world. The lesson that Dolores Jordan had begun yesterday was about to become much bigger than any of them had imagined. 3 days after the confrontation at the store, Madison Parker found herself standing in front of the Eastside Community Center at 7 in the morning, her breath forming small clouds in the cold October air. It was a completely different world from the perfumed corridors of Magnolia & Co., and she felt terribly out of place. The transformation program that Michael Jordan had orchestrated was comprehensive and relentless. He had connected Madison with Dr. Sarah Williams, a renowned diversity and inclusion expert who had worked with major corporations across the country. But Dr. Williams didn't believe in superficial change. She believed in total immersion. If you're going to truly understand what it means to be judged by appearances, Dr. Williams had explained during their first meeting, then you need to experience the world through the eyes of those who face discrimination every day. And so, Madison found herself doing something she had never done before. Genuine volunteer work. Not the performative kind she had done in college to impress future employers, but real work that required her to engage with people whose lives were fundamentally different from hers. This specific morning, she was helping prepare breakfast for homeless individuals. Maria, a 50-year-old woman who coordinated the program, had been assigned as her mentor. First rule, Maria said as Madison tied on an apron, don't pretend you understand. Don't pretend you know what it's like. Just listen and serve with respect. Madison nodded nervously. In recent weeks, she had heard the word respect more than in her entire previous life. Dr. Williams, Maria, and even Michael Jordan. They all kept returning to the same basic concept. Treat people with respect, regardless of who they are or how they appear. It seemed simple, but Madison was discovering that unlearning years of prejudice was the hardest work she had ever done. The first customer of the morning was a black man of about 40, wearing several layers of worn clothing. Madison's first instinct was to pull away, her old attitude surfacing automatically. But then she forced herself to make eye contact and smile. "Good morning," she said, serving him hot coffee. "How would you like your eggs? Scrambled, if it's no trouble." He replied politely. His voice was soft and well-articulated, contradicting all the assumptions Madison realized she was making. While preparing the plate, Madison found herself curious. "Do you come here often?" "Almost every morning for about 6 months," he said. "Since I lost my apartment." "What happened?" Madison asked, then immediately regretted it. "Sorry, I didn't mean to pry. It's no problem," he said with a sad smile. "I was an accountant. Worked for the same firm for 15 years. Then the company was sold, downsizing happened, and I was one of the cuts. My savings lasted about 4 months. After that," he gestured vaguely around the community center. Madison felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Here was a professional, educated man who had lost everything due to circumstances beyond his control, and her first reaction had been to judge him based on his appearance. I'm sorry, she said sincerely. You don't need to be sorry, he replied. Just treat me like a human being. That's all any of us want. This interaction set the tone for the rest of Madison's morning. She met a military veteran who had lost her home after a workplace injury, a young man who had aged out of the foster care system, an elderly woman whose retirement had been decimated by medical expenses. Each story challenged her preconceived notions. These weren't lazy or irresponsible people. They were individuals who had faced difficult circumstances and often simply didn't have a safety net to fall back on. After the breakfast service, Madison found herself sitting with Maria in a small room at the back of the center. "How are you processing all of this?" Maria asked gently. Madison shook her head, still trying to organize her thoughts. I've made so many assumptions about so many people. We all do, Maria said. The difference is whether we're willing to acknowledge it and change. How did you learn not to judge? Madison asked. Maria smiled sadly. Because I've been on the other side. 10 years ago, I was the person receiving the free meal. A single mother with 2 children, working 3 part-time jobs and still barely surviving. And I remember how people looked at me like I was a moral failure instead of a person facing hard times. Madison felt even more humbled. Here was a woman who had experienced exactly the kind of judgment she had dispensed to others. And yet Maria had chosen to respond with compassion instead of bitterness. How did you overcome it? The experience of being judged? Hard work, some opportunities, and many kind people who saw me as a person instead of a stereotype, Maria said. But mainly, I decided that when I had the chance, I would make sure others didn't feel the way I had felt. That afternoon, Madison drove to her weekly session with Dr. Williams. The psychologist's office was decorated with certificates and photos from various diversity programs she had implemented over the years. How was your morning at the center? Dr. Williams asked, as soon as Madison sat down. Madison described her interactions, including her conversation with the homeless accountant and her insights about Maria. Dr. Williams listened attentively, occasionally taking notes. You're beginning to understand, Dr. Williams said when Madison finished, that our first impression of someone says more about our own prejudices than about the person we're observing. But how do I stop making these assumptions? It seems automatic. It is automatic, Dr. Williams confirmed. Our brains are programmed to make quick assessments based on limited information. It was a survival feature when humans lived in small tribes. But in the modern world, these quick assessments often lead us astray. She leaned forward. The key is developing what we call a bias check. When you catch yourself making an assumption about someone, pause and ask yourself, what am I basing this on? Is it real information, or is it my own prejudice? Madison nodded, taking mental notes. And remember, Dr. Williams continued, real change takes time. You spent years developing these thought patterns. Don't expect them to disappear overnight. After the session, Madison drove home through neighborhoods she had never really noticed before. For the first time, she truly saw the people at bus stops, in parks, walking the streets. Each face had a story, a complex life full of joys and struggles she had never considered. When she arrived at her apartment, Madison found an envelope that had been slipped under her door. Inside was a handwritten note on elegant paper. Dear Madison, I heard from Michael about the program you've begun. I wanted you to know that I'm rooting for you. Change is never easy, but it's always possible for those brave enough to try. If you'd ever like to talk, feel free to call me. Sometimes it's helpful to speak with someone who understands both giving second chances and receiving them. With hope, Dolores Jordan. Madison looked at the note for a long time, tears forming in her eyes. Here was the woman she had treated so terribly, extending kindness and encouragement. It was more grace than Madison felt she deserved. She picked up her phone and, before she could lose her nerve, dialed the number listed at the bottom of the note. "Hello?" came the familiar, warm voice. "Mrs. Jordan? It's Madison Parker. From the store." There was a pause. And then, "Oh dear. What a joy to hear from you. Michael told me about your journey. How are you feeling?" For several minutes, Madison couldn't speak. The kindness in Dolores's voice, after everything that had happened, was almost overwhelming. I'm learning a lot about myself," Madison finally managed to say. "And I don't like everything I'm seeing." "That's good," Dolores said softly. "Recognizing our flaws is the first step to overcoming them. And dear, we all have flaws. The question is whether we're willing to do the work to become better." They talked for almost an hour. Dolores shared stories from her own youth, moments when she had judged others and had to learn better ways. She spoke about raising children in a world that often judged them before even knowing them, and about choosing to respond to prejudice with education rather than anger. "What saddened me most that day in the store," Dolores said, "wasn't how you treated me, but recognizing that someone so young and clearly intelligent had learned to see the world in a way that would make her unhappy." "Unhappy? Oh yes, dear. Prejudice is a prison. It keeps you separate from genuine connections with other human beings. And in the end, those connections are what make life rich and meaningful." When Madison finally hung up the phone, she felt simultaneously exhausted and energized. The road ahead was still long. But for the first time since everything had begun, she felt hopeful that she could truly change. The next morning, she returned to the community center. And the morning after that, and the next. Each day brought new lessons, new challenges to her assumptions, new examples of human dignity in places she had never thought to look. And slowly, gradually, Madison Parker began to become a different person, not just in her actions, but in her thoughts, her instincts, her fundamental understanding of what it meant to be human. True transformation had begun. 6 weeks had passed since Madison began her transformation program, and the changes in her perspective were becoming impossible to ignore. On this specific November morning, she found herself in a place she never imagined visiting. A shelter for women, victims of domestic violence. Jennifer, a 35-year-old social worker with curly hair and kind eyes that carried the wisdom of someone who had seen much suffering, was showing Madison the basics of her volunteer work there. "The most important thing," Jennifer explained as they prepared activities for the shelter's children, "is never to ask questions about what brought someone here. They'll share if and when they feel comfortable." Madison nodded, organizing crayons and paper. In recent weeks, she had learned to value this approach, allowing people to reveal themselves on their own terms, rather than making assumptions based on appearances or circumstances. "And remember," Jennifer continued, "some of these women have come from very traumatic situations. Sudden movements, loud voices, even gentle gestures can be triggers." When the first families began entering the activity room, Madison was struck by how normal they looked. There was something in her mind, some remnants of her old prejudices that expected abuse victims to look a certain way. Fragile, perhaps, or clearly marked by their traumas. Instead, she saw women of all ages and backgrounds, some wearing professional work clothes, others in jeans and t-shirts, some clearly trying to maintain a normal appearance for the sake of their children. One woman in particular caught her attention not because of her appearance, but because of the protective posture with which she held her 4-year-old daughter. The woman, who appeared to be about 30, had a discreet bandage on her left wrist, and her eyes constantly moved around the environment, as if assessing potential threats. "Hi," Madison said softly, crouching to the child's level. "I'm Madison. What's your name?" "Sophie," the little girl whispered, hiding behind her mother's legs. "Nice to meet you, Sophie. We have some fun activities planned for today. Do you like coloring?" Sophie nodded shyly, and her mother, who introduced herself as Rachel, visibly relaxed, seeing that Madison wasn't asking invasive questions or treating the situation as if it were unusual or strange. As the morning progressed, Madison found herself genuinely enjoying the time with the children. There was something healing about their innocent laughter, their direct questions, and their ability to live in the present moment despite the difficult circumstances that had brought them to the shelter. Sophie, who had initially been shy, began to warm up to Madison. She proudly showed off her drawings and chattered about her favorite toys and cartoons. "My mommy says we're going to have our own house soon," Sophie shared while coloring a butterfly. "With a garden where I can plant flowers." "That sounds wonderful," Madison replied, her throat slightly tight with emotion. Looking at Rachel across the room, she could see determination and hope competing with fear in the older woman's eyes. During lunch, Rachel approached Madison. "Thank you for being so kind to Sophie," she said quietly. "It's been difficult for her to adjust. She doesn't understand why we had to leave everything behind." Madison wanted to ask about the situation, wanted to understand what had happened, but remembered Jennifer's instructions. Instead, she simply said, "Sophie is a special little girl, and she clearly has a strong mother who loves her very much." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "Sometimes I don't feel strong. Sometimes I feel like the weakest person in the world. I don't think weak people risk everything to protect their children," Madison said gently. "I think that requires a courage most of us never have to find." It was a perspective that would have been impossible for the old Madison. A few weeks ago, she might have judged Rachel for choosing to be in an abusive situation, without understanding the complexity, fear, and economic traps that often keep people trapped in dangerous relationships. After lunch, Jennifer pulled Madison aside. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Humbled," Madison said honestly, "and grateful, and kind of overwhelmed by how little I understood about anything, really." Jennifer smiled understandingly. "That's what real growth looks like. Uncomfortable, but necessary." "Jennifer, can I ask you a personal question?" "Sure. Why do you do this work? It must be emotionally draining." Jennifer considered the question for a moment. "Because 12 years ago, I was one of the women in this shelter. And the people who helped me, who treated me with dignity when I felt completely broken, they saved my life. Not just literally, but helped me remember that I had value." Madison looked at her in shock. Jennifer, who seemed so confident and capable, had been in a situation similar to Rachel's and the other women in the shelter. "And now you dedicate your life to helping others." "Now I have the opportunity to give back," Jennifer corrected, "and to ensure that when someone is at the lowest point of their life, they find compassion instead of judgment." That afternoon, Madison drove to her weekly session with Dr. Williams with her mind spinning. The pattern was becoming clear in every place where she had done volunteer work. With every person she had spoken to, she discovered that her previous assumptions had been not just wrong, but cruel in their simplicity. "You seem thoughtful today," Dr. Williams observed as soon as Madison sat down. Madison told her about her morning at the shelter, about Sophie and Rachel, about learning Jennifer's story. "What impressed you most about the experience?" Dr. Williams asked. "That I would have judged every one of those people," Madison said, her voice almost a whisper. "A few weeks ago, if I had seen Rachel with a bandage, or if Jennifer had told me she had been in a shelter, I would have assumed there was something wrong with them, some character flaw that put them in those situations. And now? Now I see that life is much more complicated than I ever understood, that bad things happen to good people, and that real strength has nothing to do with never falling. It has to do with getting up and helping others get up too." Dr. Williams smiled. "That's a profound insight, Madison, and it shows real growth in your capacity for empathy. But it's also terrible," Madison continued, "because it means I spent years being the kind of person who makes life harder for people who were already struggling. How many people did I hurt without even knowing?" "The guilt you're feeling, Doctor," Williams said gently, "is a sign that you've developed a real moral compass. But you can't change the past. You can only choose how to act from now on. How do I forgive myself? By doing better, consistently, and by using your experiences to help others avoid the same mistakes. That evening, Madison found herself calling Dolores Jordan again. Their weekly conversations had become an anchor in her transformation journey. "How are you, dear?" Dolores asked, her voice carrying the same warmth as always. Madison described her day, her insights, and her ongoing struggles with guilt and regret. "May I tell you a story?" Dolores asked when Madison finished. "Please." When Michael was little, he had a tendency to judge others quickly. One day, when he was about 8 years old, he was cruel to a classmate who wore shabby clothes. When I found out, I was ready to give him a severe scolding. Madison listened intently, but then I thought of a different approach. Instead of punishing him, I took him to meet the boy's family. We saw how they lived, understood their struggles. Michael realized the boy was smart, funny, and a loyal friend, but his family simply didn't have money for nice clothes. "What happened?" Michael apologized, and they became best friends. But more importantly, Michael learned a lesson about not judging people based on appearances, a lesson that served him for the rest of his life. Madison was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to know that even good people, people we love and admire, sometimes act based on prejudices. The difference is whether we learn and grow from those experiences." Did Michael ever talk about feeling bad for judging that boy? Oh yes, for years. But he used that guilt as motivation to always treat people better. And look at the man he became. Way. After the call, Madison sat in her living room, reflecting on Dolores's story. There was something deeply comforting about knowing that even Michael Jordan had struggled with issues similar to hers, and that he had chosen to use his experiences to become better. She looked at her calendar and noticed there were only 2 weeks left before officially returning to Magnolia & Co. to begin her new role as training coordinator. The prospect both scared and excited her. She had changed so much in recent weeks, not just in her attitudes, but in her fundamental understanding of what it meant to be human. Now, she would be tested to see if she could transmit these lessons to others. Madison picked up a notebook and began to write. Not a business plan or professional presentation, but an honest reflection on her journey and the lessons she had learned. It was raw, emotional material and completely different from anything she had ever written before. When she finished, several hours later, she had more than 10 pages of insights, stories, and ideas about how to create a training program that was both practical and transformative. For the first time since everything had begun, Madison felt truly hopeful about the future. Not just her own future, but her ability to make a positive difference in other people's lives. The student was becoming the teacher, and the journey was just beginning. The day had arrived. After 2.5 months of intensive transformation, Madison Parker stood in front of her bathroom mirror, preparing to return to Magnolia & Co. Not as the arrogant employee who had left, but as coordinator of diversity and inclusion training. Her reflected image showed changes that went far beyond physical appearance, though those were notable too. Where there had once been calculated rigidity in her posture, there was now a softer, more genuine confidence. Her eyes, which used to constantly evaluate and categorize, now seemed more open, more receptive. Madison had carefully chosen her outfit for this first day. Nothing too formal or intimidating. A simple navy blazer over a white blouse, dark pants, and comfortable low heels. It was professional but approachable. She wanted her colleagues to see her as someone who had changed, not as someone trying to impress or dominate. While driving to work, Madison reflected on recent months. The volunteer work had been only part of her transformation. Dr. Williams had also facilitated group sessions with people from diverse backgrounds, where Madison had heard stories that challenged every prejudice she had ever held. She had met Maria, a successful Latina executive who spoke about being constantly mistaken for cleaning staff at corporate events. David, a Black PhD, professor who described being followed in expensive stores where he had much more money to spend than most other customers. Sarah, a 50-year-old woman who had been laid off from her senior position and now worked in retail, daily facing condescension from people who assumed she had never done anything better with her life. Each story had been a lesson, each person a mirror reflecting her own prejudices and the pain they caused. When Madison parked in front of Magnolia & Co., she saw a group of her former colleagues gathered near the entrance. Her approach caused a noticeable silence. Some seemed genuinely happy to see her. Others clearly didn't know how to react. "Madison," exclaimed Jennifer, one of the senior salespeople. "So good to see you back." "Thank you, Jen," Madison replied, her voice warmer than it used to be. "It's good to be back." Thomas, a salesman of about 30 who had always been particularly competitive, approached with a skeptical expression. "So, I heard you're our new training consultant?" There was something in his tone that suggested disbelief, as if Madison's transformation were just an elaborate show. "Diversity and Inclusion Training Coordinator," Madison corrected gently. "And yes, that's my new role." "And what exactly does that mean?" Thomas asked. "Are we going to have to attend seminars on how to be politically correct?" Before Madison could respond, Harold Magnolia appeared at the store entrance. In recent weeks, he had worked closely with Michael Jordan and his team to implement changes in the store, and was visibly nervous but optimistic about the new direction. "Madison, welcome back," he said warmly. "We're eager to see your plans." When they entered the store, Madison was struck by how different things seemed. Not physically, the displays were the same. The products were similar, but there was a different energy. The employees seemed more attentive, more aware of how they interacted with customers. Harold led her to a small conference room that had been converted into her temporary office. On the table were stacks of training materials that Dr. Williams had helped prepare, as well as reports on best practices from other stores that had implemented similar programs. "Michael Jordan left something for you," Harold said, handing her a sealed envelope. Madison opened it to find a handwritten letter. "Madison, today you begin a new phase of your journey. Remember that the goal isn't just to avoid discrimination, it's to create an environment where every person who enters our store feels valued and respected. You have the tools now. More importantly, you have the personal experience of transformation. Use both. My mother asked me to tell you she's rooting for you. As am I. Michael." Attached to the letter was a photo of Dolores Jordan smiling warmly, signed, "For Madison, with love and hope." Mrs. D. Madison felt tears forming in her eyes. After everything that had happened, these people had not only forgiven her, but were genuinely invested in her success. Her first task was to observe the store's normal interactions. Harold had arranged for her to spend the morning simply watching how employees interacted with diverse customers. What she saw was a revelation. It was as if she had gained new eyes. She noticed Thomas being slightly more formal with black customers, as if he were being extra careful, but in a way that created distance. She saw Jennifer being overly solicitous with an elderly Asian woman, speaking louder as if assuming the customer didn't speak English well, when the woman responded in perfectly articulated English. More troubling, she observed a young Hispanic customer being discreetly followed by 2 employees while browsing the expensive electronics section. During lunch, Madison called an informal meeting with the entire team. "First," she began, "I want to thank everyone for welcoming me back. I know this is an unusual situation." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "During my time away, I learned some things about myself that were difficult to accept. I learned that I had developed thought patterns that led me to treat people differently based on appearances or assumptions." Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "But I also learned," Madison continued, "that change is possible, and that when we treat every person with genuine respect, we not only create a better experience for customers, we create a better experience for ourselves." Jennifer raised her hand. "Madison, can you give a specific example?" Madison smiled. It was exactly the kind of practical question she had expected. Of course. This morning, I observed a Hispanic customer being discreetly followed while looking at our electronics. The employees probably thought they were being vigilant. But imagine how that made the customer feel. How would you feel if you were followed every time you went shopping? An uncomfortable silence followed. I didn't realize we were doing that, said Marcus, one of the younger employees. And that's exactly the point, Madison responded gently. Often, we don't notice our own biases. The training we're going to implement is designed to help us become more aware of these unconscious patterns. Thomas finally spoke. So, you're saying we're all racists? No, Madison said firmly but kindly. I'm saying that all of us, myself included, grew up in a society that taught us to make certain assumptions about people. The goal isn't to feel guilty about it, but to recognize it and learn to do better. She paused, letting her words sink in. Thomas, may I ask you a question? He nodded reluctantly. Have you ever been in a situation where someone made assumptions about you based on your appearance? Thomas thought for a moment. Well, yeah. When I was in college, I worked part-time at a retail store. People always assumed I was just some dumb college kid who didn't know anything. How did that feel? Frustrating. Disrespectful. Exactly. Now imagine feeling that way, not just occasionally, but almost every time you enter a store, apply for a job, or interact with people in positions of authority. Madison could see understanding dawning in Thomas's eyes. The difference is, she continued, your experience was temporary. For many people, that's their daily reality. The rest of the meeting was spent discussing specific scenarios and brainstorming better approaches. Madison was impressed by how quickly her colleagues began to engage once they understood that the goal wasn't to criticize them, but to help everyone succeed. After work, Madison drove to visit Dolores Jordan. It had been planned as a thank you visit, but Madison found herself needing reassurance that she was on the right track. Dolores welcomed her into a comfortable living room filled with family photos and memorabilia from Michael's career, but also evidence of a life well lived beyond her famous son. Books, plants, artwork that spoke of a woman with varied interests and deep curiosity about the world. Tell me about your first day back, Dolores said, offering Madison tea. Madison described the morning's observations, the staff meeting, and her colleagues' reactions. You sound disappointed, Dolores observed. Not disappointed exactly. But I guess I hoped that once I pointed out these issues, everyone would immediately want to change. Dolores smiled, knowingly. Change is scary, dear. Most people resist it, even when they know it's right. How do I help them see that this isn't about making them feel bad, the same way someone helped you see? Dolores replied. With patience, understanding, and consistent example, you can't force people to change their hearts. You can only create conditions where change becomes possible. They talked for almost 2 hours, with Dolores sharing stories from her years as a teacher and the insights she had gained about human nature. When Madison finally left, she felt renewed in her commitment to the long, difficult work ahead. As she drove home, Madison's phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. Hi, this is Rachel from the shelter. Jennifer gave me your number. Sophie drew you a picture and wants to send it. Also wanted to thank you for treating us like normal people. It meant more than you know. Madison pulled over and stared at the message for several minutes. Here was proof that her transformation had had real impact on another person's life. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was about consistent, daily choices to see and treat others as full human beings. When she got home, Madison sat down and began planning her next training session. She had a long way to go, and her colleagues had even further to travel. But for the first time since this whole journey began, she felt truly hopeful about what they could accomplish together. Change was possible. She was living proof of that. Now it was time to help others discover their own capacity for growth and transformation. 3 weeks after Madison had returned to Magnolia & Co., tensions in the store had begun to simmer beneath the surface of professional politeness. The training program she had implemented was producing mixed results. Some employees were genuinely engaged, while others grew increasingly resistant. The situation came to a head on a particularly busy Thursday in November. Madison was reviewing customer feedback reports when she heard raised voices coming from the men's clothing section. She approached discreetly and saw Thomas in a heated discussion with James, a middle-aged black customer who was wearing a well-tailored suit. "Sir, as I already explained, that shirt costs $400, Thomas was saying, his voice loaded with barely disguised condescension. "Perhaps you'd like to look at our selection of more accessible products." Madison felt her stomach tighten. It was exactly the kind of behavior her training aimed to eliminate, and it was happening right in front of other customers. "Young man," James replied with controlled dignity, "I understand the price of the shirt. What I don't understand is why you're assuming I can't afford it." "It's not a matter of assuming anything," Thomas retorted, but his body language communicated exactly the opposite. "I'm just trying to be realistic about the options." Madison knew she had to intervene, but also recognized that doing so publicly could humiliate Thomas and make the situation worse. Instead, she approached with a professional smile. "Thomas, may I speak with you for a moment?" she said calmly. Then, addressing James, "Sir, I apologize for the interruption. May I help you find what you're looking for?" Thomas hesitated for a moment, clearly irritated by the intervention, but eventually stepped away. Madison spent the next 20 minutes helping James select not only the shirt he initially wanted, but also a tie and cufflinks that perfectly complemented his professional wardrobe. During the process, she discovered he was a cardiologist who had recently moved to Charlotte to take a position at the city's main hospital. "Dr. Williams," Madison said as she finalized the sale of over $1,000. "I hope you have an excellent experience in our city. If you need any recommendations for services or local establishments, I'd be happy to help." "Thank you," he replied, his expression softening. "And thank you for making this a positive experience after a complicated beginning." After Dr. Williams left, Madison found Thomas in the employee break room, visibly agitated. "You embarrassed me out there," he said as soon as she entered. "That wasn't my intention, Thomas, but we need to talk about what happened." "Oh, here we go," Thomas muttered, rolling his eyes. "Another diversity lecture." "Thomas," Madison said, keeping her voice calm, "you just potentially cost the store a sale of over $1,000. More importantly, you treated a doctor customer as if he were, what, someone who didn't deserve to be here?" "I was just being practical," Thomas defended himself. "You didn't see how he was dressed when he came in. Jeans and a simple t-shirt. How was I supposed to know he had money?" Madison felt a pang of painful recognition. It had been exactly this kind of reasoning that had led her to treat Michael Jordan's mother so poorly. "Thomas, may I tell you a personal story?" He crossed his arms but nodded. "A few weeks ago, I did exactly what you just did. A woman entered the store wearing simple clothes, and I immediately assumed she couldn't afford our more expensive pieces. I treated her with condescension and basically drove her out of the store." Thomas looked at her with growing curiosity. It turns out that woman was Michael Jordan's mother, and she had more money to spend on a single item than any of us makes in an entire year. Thomas's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Completely serious. And the humiliation I felt when I found out was nothing compared to the shame of realizing I had judged a wonderful person based solely on appearances." Madison sat down next to him. "Thomas, you're a talented salesperson. Your numbers have always been solid. But imagine how many sales you might have lost over the years by making assumptions about who can or can't afford our products." Thomas was quiet for several minutes, processing what he had heard. "So what you're saying is I should treat everyone like they're millionaires?" "I'm saying you should treat everyone with the same respect and attention, regardless of how they appear. Not just because it might be good for business, but because it's the right thing to do." Their conversation was interrupted by Harold Magnolia, who appeared at the break room door with a worried expression. "Madison, May I speak with you? Madison followed Harold to his office, where she found a clearly agitated middle-aged couple. Madison, these are Mr. and Mrs. Richardson. They just had a problematic experience in our jewelry section. Mrs. Richardson, an elegantly dressed Latina woman, was the first to speak. We came here to buy engagement rings for our daughter. When we asked about a specific piece, the employee told us we might want to consider options more within our budget. Without even asking what our budget was, Madison felt her heart sink. May I ask which employee served you? A young blonde woman, said Mr. Richardson, very well dressed, but with an unpleasant attitude. Madison immediately knew who they were talking about. Angela, a 24-year-old employee who had been hired about 6 months ago, had consistently shown resistance to the training program. Mr. and Mrs. Richardson, I would like to offer my sincere apologies, Madison said. This behavior doesn't align with our values, and I assure you it will be addressed appropriately. We appreciate that, said Mrs. Richardson. But frankly, we're considering taking our business elsewhere. This wasn't our first incident here. Madison looked at Harold, who appeared even more concerned. May I ask if you would be willing to give me a chance to correct this situation? I would personally like to help you find exactly what you're looking for and ensure you have the experience you deserve. The couple exchanged glances and, after a brief, whispered discussion, agreed to give them a second chance. Madison spent the next hour working with the Richardsons, not just to find the perfect ring for their daughter, but really listening to their story. She discovered they were owners of a successful small restaurant chain, and that this purchase was part of a special family tradition where parents present engagement rings to their daughters as a symbol of approval and blessing. The final sale was over $5,000, but more importantly, Madison had managed to transform a negative experience into a positive one. The Richardsons left not only satisfied, but impressed with the personalized and respectful service. After they left, Madison knew she had a difficult conversation ahead. She found Angela, organizing the jewelry inventory, apparently unconcerned about the earlier incident. Angela, we need to talk about what happened with the Richardson couple. Angela sighed dramatically. What an overreaction. I was just being efficient, trying to direct them to more suitable products. Suitable based on what? Based on experience. Madison, you weren't there. By the clothes they were wearing, the way they spoke, it was obvious they weren't our typical customers for $5,000 pieces. Madison felt a wave of frustration. It was like looking into a mirror of her former self, seeing the same arrogance and blindness that had once characterized her. Angela, they just bought a $5,000 piece, after being initially discouraged by your assumptions. Well, that was unexpected. It was unexpected because you judged wrong. And this isn't the first time, is it? Angela crossed her arms defensively. Look, Madison, I know you went through this whole transformation, or whatever, but that doesn't mean all of us need to pretend the world is different from what it really is. And what is the world really like, Angela? Realistic. Some people have money. Others don't. Some people are our target customers. Others are just wasting our time. There's nothing wrong with recognizing that. Madison realized she was facing a crucial choice. Angela represented exactly the kind of thinking that had nearly destroyed her own career. But unlike her own situation, where Michael Jordan had offered an opportunity for redemption, Angela was actively resisting change. Angela, I'm going to be very clear, Madison said, her voice taking on a firmness she hadn't used before. The behavior you demonstrated today is unacceptable. It's not just bad for business, it's discriminatory and harmful. You're being ridiculously dramatic. I'm being responsible. And you have a choice to make. You can genuinely participate in the training and work to change your attitudes, or you can look for employment elsewhere. Angela stared at her in shock. Are you threatening me? I'm being clear about expectations. This store is committed to treating all customers with equal respect. If you can't do that, then this isn't the right place for you. Angela stormed off, leaving Madison alone with her reflections. It was the first time she had faced direct and hostile resistance to the change program, and it was emotionally draining. That evening, Madison called Dr. Williams to discuss the day. "How are you feeling about the confrontation with Angela?" Dr. Williams asked. "Drained," Madison admitted. "And a little scared. She reminded me so much of myself a few months ago that it was like looking in a mirror." "And is that bad?" "It's terrible, because it makes me realize how harmful I must have been. How many people I might have hurt with my arrogance." "Madison," Dr. Williams said gently, "you can't save everyone. Your own transformation is proof that change is possible. But it has to come from within. You can offer tools and opportunities, but you can't force someone to grow. So what do I do about Angela? You give her the same thing Michael Jordan gave you, a real chance to change, with clear consequences if she chooses not to take advantage of that chance." After the call, Madison sat at her kitchen table and began to write. Not a report or training plan, but an honest reflection on the challenges of promoting change in people who don't want to change. It was harder work than she had imagined, but it was also more important work than she had ever done. And for the first time, Madison began to truly understand why Michael Jordan had chosen to give her a second chance instead of simply firing her. Real change, she discovered, doesn't happen through punishment or humiliation. It happens through persistent patience, consistent example, and the courage to set boundaries when necessary. The true test of the training program wouldn't be with people like Thomas, who were open to growth. It would be with people like Angela and with herself, as she learned to navigate the delicate line between compassion and accountability. 2 weeks after the confrontation with Angela, Madison arrived at work to find Harold Magnolia standing at the store entrance with a somber expression. Next to him was a man in a dark suit she didn't recognize, holding a leather briefcase. "Madison," Harold said as soon as she approached. "This is David Chen, our attorney. We need to speak with you immediately." Madison's heart raced. Over the past weeks, Angela had become increasingly difficult to work with, frequently making sarcastic comments about the training program and demonstrating passive-aggressive resistance to any change. Madison had begun documenting these incidents, suspecting she would eventually have to take disciplinary action. They headed to Harold's office, where David Chen opened his briefcase and removed a stack of documents. "Madison," he began, "we've received a formal complaint from Angela Peters alleging that she's being harassed and discriminated against due to the training program you implemented." Madison felt as if she'd been hit by a truck. "What?" "Specifically," David continued, "she alleges that you created a hostile work environment by constantly criticizing her sales practices, that you singled her out for special treatment due to her politically incorrect opinions, and that the training program as a whole constitutes a form of ideological brainwashing." Harold looked uncomfortable as David spoke, but was also clearly concerned about the legal implications. "She also alleges," David continued, "that when she expressed discomfort with aspects of the training, you threatened her with dismissal if she didn't conform to the party line." Madison looked from one man to the other, her mind racing. "This is completely distorted. Yes, I had conversations with Angela about her inadequate customer service. Yes, I made it clear that discriminatory behavior wouldn't be tolerated. But harassment? Brainwashing? That's ridiculous." David nodded. "It may seem ridiculous to us, but legally, we have to take any allegation of a hostile work environment seriously, especially when it involves potential discrimination based on political or religious beliefs." "Political beliefs?" Madison asked, confused. "Angela alleges that the diversity training program is essentially liberal political propaganda, and that she's being punished for her conservative beliefs." Harold finally spoke. "Madison, did you document your interactions with Angela?" "Yes," Madison replied immediately. "I kept detailed records of every incident, including dates, times, witnesses, and her specific responses to feedback." "Good," David said. We'll need to review all of that. And unfortunately, until we resolve this issue, we'll have to temporarily suspend the training program. Madison felt her world falling apart. Suspend? But we're making real progress. Thomas has completely transformed how he treats customers. Jennifer is genuinely engaged. Even some of the more resistant employees are starting to understand. I understand, Harold said. And I, personally, completely support what you're doing. But we can't afford a costly legal battle, especially when we're still recovering financially. That afternoon, Madison found herself sitting in the store parking lot, feeling completely defeated. She had called Dr. Williams, who agreed to meet with her immediately. "How are you dealing with this?" Dr. Williams asked as soon as they sat in her office. "I'm furious," Madison admitted. "I'm furious with Angela for twisting everything. I'm furious with myself for not anticipating this. And I'm furious with a system that allows people to avoid accountability by claiming discrimination when they're called to account for discriminatory behavior." "Those are valid feelings," Dr. Williams said. "But now that you've expressed that anger, let's talk about what can be done." Can anything be done? Angela essentially weaponized the legal system against the program. Madison, do you remember the first time we talked about real change? Madison nodded. I said it would be difficult and that you would face resistance. This is that resistance. The question is, are you going to let it stop you, or will you find a way to keep moving forward? How can I keep moving forward if the program is suspended? Real change doesn't happen because of mandatory training programs, Dr. Williams explained. It happens because of people who consistently model better behavior, who treat others with genuine respect, and who influence their peers through example. Madison reflected on this. So, you're saying the formal program doesn't matter as much as I thought? I'm saying the formal program was just a tool. The real change always had to come from people, one person at a time. One interaction at a time. That evening, Madison called Michael Jordan. It was the first time she had initiated contact with him since the program began. But she felt she needed to inform him about what was happening. I heard about the situation, Michael said as soon as she explained. I'm sorry, Madison said. I know you invested a lot in this program, and I failed. You didn't fail, Michael replied firmly. You encountered resistance. That's different, but the program is suspended. All the work we did might be lost. Madison, may I tell you a story? Please. When I was playing, sometimes we faced teams that use strategies designed to frustrate us and throw us off our game. They used tactics that were technically legal, but designed to create chaos and confusion. Madison listened intently. The issue wasn't avoiding those tactics, it was how we responded to them. We could let them distract us and lose focus, or we could use them as motivation to play even better. Are you saying I should see this as motivation? I'm saying Angela just gave you something very valuable. Proof that the program was working. Madison was confused. How so? Think about it. Why would she feel threatened enough to take legal action? People confident in their positions don't do that. People who feel their world is changing in ways they can't control do that. Madison had never thought about it that way. Besides, Michael continued, you just learned a valuable lesson about implementing change. There will always be people who resist, and some will use any available tool to maintain the status quo. That doesn't mean you stop, it means you become smarter about how to proceed. After the call, Madison felt somewhat less defeated, but still uncertain about the next steps. That's when her phone rang. It was Thomas. Madison? I heard about what happened with Angela. I wanted you to know that some of us employees don't agree with what she did. Thomas, thank you for calling, but you don't need to get involved in this. But I want to get involved, he insisted. The training you did with me, it changed how I see my work. It changed how I see people. I don't want to go back to what I was before. Idealin, end quote. Throughout the evening, Madison received similar calls from Jennifer, Marcus, and 3 other employees. Each expressed support for the program and frustration with Angela's tactics. "What do you want us to do?" Jennifer asked during her call. "Just continue being examples of how to treat people well," Madison replied. "Regardless of what happens formally, you can continue applying what you learned. But what about you? Are you going to keep working with us?" Madison paused. Honestly, she wasn't sure. The legal situation was still unresolved, and there was a real possibility she could lose her job. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I know the work we did together wasn't lost. You've internalized these lessons. Angela can stop the formal program, but she can't stop you from choosing to be better." When she finally went to bed that night, Madison felt strangely at peace despite the uncertainty. She had learned something important. Real change couldn't be stopped by legal tactics or institutional resistance. It could only be slowed or temporarily obscured. And tomorrow, regardless of what happened with the formal program, she would continue doing the work of treating every person she met with dignity and respect. Because that wasn't something Angela or anyone else could take away from her. The true transformation had become part of who she was, not just what she did for a living. The next morning, Madison arrived at the store to find a tense and strange atmosphere. Angela was at her usual station, but clearly avoiding eye contact with anyone. Other employees whispered in small groups, occasionally glancing in Madison's direction. Harold called her to his office as soon as she arrived. "We have developments," he said, looking like a mixture of relief and confusion. "David Chen wants to meet with you in an hour. Apparently, some people have voluntarily come forward to offer testimony about the training program." Madison frowned. "What kind of testimony? That's the strange part," Harold said. "It's not just our employees. It's customers. Customers who apparently heard about the situation and want to speak about their experiences in the store." An hour later, Madison found herself in David Chen's law firm conference room, looking at a group of people she recognized, but had never expected to meet under these circumstances. Dr. James Williams was there, the cardiologist Thomas had treated poorly a few weeks earlier. Next to him were Mr. and Mrs. Richardson, the couple who had bought engagement rings after the incident with Angela. But there were other people too, faces Madison recognized as regular customers, but with whom she had never had extensive conversations. David Chen opened the meeting by explaining that he had received calls from several customers who wanted to share their experiences related to Angela's allegations. Dr. Williams was the first to speak. "I must admit that when I received a call about this situation, I initially hesitated to get involved," he began. "But then I remembered the difference between how I was treated by one employee versus how I was treated by Madison. And I realized this had broader implications." He turned to look directly at Madison. "The employee, Thomas, I believe initially treated me with condescension based on my casual appearance. He made assumptions about my ability to pay for the store's products. But when Madison intervened, the difference was remarkable. Not just in customer service, but in the fundamental approach to how people should be treated." Dr. Williams paused. "A week later, I returned to the store specifically to work with Thomas again. I wanted to see if Madison's intervention had been just performance or real change." Madison straightened, surprised. She didn't know Dr. Williams had returned. "Thomas was like a different person," Dr. Williams continued. "Professional, respectful, genuinely helpful. He had clearly learned something from the experience. When I asked him about the change, he mentioned a training program he was participating in." David Chen took notes furiously as Dr. Williams spoke. "As a physician, I frequently see the effects of implicit bias in professional environments. What Madison created wasn't political brainwashing. It was training in cultural competency and respectful service. That shouldn't be controversial." Mrs. Richardson was next to speak. "My husband and I had a similar experience. We were initially treated in a way that suggested we didn't belong in that store. But Madison didn't just correct the situation, she transformed it into something positive." She looked directly at David Chen. "We're business owners. We understand customer service issues. What Madison is doing isn't politics, it's good business sense. Mr. Richardson nodded. Since our experience with Madison, we've returned to the store several times. We've recommended it to friends. That's what good customer service does. It creates loyalty and referrals. But it was the next testimony that truly shocked Madison. Maria Santos, a woman in her 40s whom Madison recognized as a regular customer, stood up to speak. "I've been shopping at Magnolia & Co. for 5 years," she began. "And during that time, I regularly experienced the type of treatment Dr. Williams and the Richardsons described. Employees who followed me around the store, who immediately directed me to the cheapest items, who acted surprised when I made large purchases." Madison felt her stomach tighten. She had no idea that a regular customer had been going through this. But in recent weeks, Maria continued, "I noticed a change. The employees are being trained differently. They make eye contact. They ask questions about what I'm looking for instead of assuming. They treat me like they treat other customers." She paused. "When I learned this training was being challenged, I knew I had to speak up. Because, from what I can tell, the only person being discriminated against is Madison for trying to create an environment where all customers are treated equally." David Chen looked up from his notes. "Miss Santos, did you document any of these previous experiences?" "I have purchase receipts dating back 5 years, showing I'm a loyal, high-spending customer. And I have witnesses to several of the problematic interactions, friends who were with me when they were treated poorly." One of the other customers present, an older man named Robert Chen. "I've been a customer of this store for 15 years. My late wife and I used to shop there regularly. After she died, I continued going occasionally, but I must admit the experiences became less pleasant." He paused, clearly emotional. "As an elderly Asian man shopping alone, I began to notice that I was treated differently. Less attention, less patience, assumptions that I was confused or lost. I started shopping elsewhere." Madison remembered seeing Mr. Chen several times over the years, but had never really paid attention to how other employees interacted with him. "Recently, I decided to give the store one more try. The difference was remarkable. The staff was attentive, patient, professional. When I commented on the improvement, one of the employees mentioned new training they had received." He looked directly at Madison. "I don't know you personally, miss, but I know the difference between discrimination and education. What I experienced in recent visits was education in action." David Chen closed his notebook and looked around the room. "This is very helpful testimony," he said. "It provides important context that will help us address this situation appropriately." After the customers left, David turned to Madison. "Based on what I heard today, combined with your documentation of the incidents with Angela, I believe we have a strong case that the training program not only doesn't constitute a hostile work environment, but is actually necessary for ensuring equal treatment of customers." Madison felt a wave of relief, but tried to maintain realistic expectations. "What does this mean for the program?" "It means we're going to challenge Angela's complaints vigorously. More importantly, it means the program can resume immediately." Harold, who had been silent throughout the meeting, finally spoke. "Madison, I owe you an apology. I should have supported you more firmly from the beginning. What those customers described, that's not the kind of store I want to run." "Mr. Magnolia, you were protecting the business. I understand that." "No," Harold said firmly. "I was being a coward. Those customers who testified today, they're the kind of clients we want to attract and keep. Angela's complaints not only lack merit, they actively work against our business interests." Our. David Chen gathered his papers. "I'll be communicating our position to Angela's representation. Given the testimony we heard today, I suspect she'll be encouraged to withdraw her complaints." That afternoon, Madison returned to the store with a new sense of purpose. What had begun as a crisis had become a powerful validation, not just of the training program, but of the principle it represented. Thomas approached her as soon as she entered. "Madison, I heard about the customers who testified. What's that? Before the training, I probably treated some of those customers the same way I treated Dr. Williams initially. I never realized the impact it was having. Madison nodded. That's part of the learning process, Thomas. Recognition is the first step. Jennifer joined the conversation. Are you going to be able to continue the program? Looks like it, Madison said. But I learned something important today. A program is only as good as the people implementing it. And you all proved today that you've already internalized these lessons. As she looked around at her colleagues, people who had demonstrated genuine growth and commitment even when faced with adversity, Madison realized that the real victory wasn't legal or institutional. It was the human connections that had been formed, the mindsets that had been changed, and the culture that was slowly but surely being transformed, one interaction at a time. Angela's challenge had ultimately strengthened rather than weakened the foundation they had built together. And that foundation was strong enough to withstand much more than legal threats. It was strong enough to change lives. 3 days after the testimonies, Angela Peters quietly cleaned out her desk and left Magnolia & Co. without fanfare or dramatic confrontation. David Chen had informed Madison that Angela had withdrawn her accusations after her lawyer reviewed the customer testimony and the meticulous documentation Madison had maintained. But what impressed Madison most was that Angela's departure was met not with celebration, but with sober reflection by the entire team. During a team meeting the next morning, Thomas was the first to speak. I know we're all relieved this is over, he said. But I keep thinking about something. Angela wasn't a bad person. She just never really understood the point. Jennifer nodded. It's sad, actually. She could have learned and grown with us. Madison observed this exchange with deep satisfaction. Her team had developed exactly the kind of empathetic thinking the program aimed to promote, the ability to see even their adversaries as complex human beings deserving of understanding. You're absolutely right, she said. And that tells me you've truly internalized these lessons. It's easy to have compassion for people who agree with us. It's much harder to maintain that compassion for people who've caused us problems. Harold Magnolia entered the room with an expression Madison couldn't decipher. Madison, I just got off a very interesting call, he said. Apparently, word about our situation has spread in the business community. Madison felt a pang of anxiety. What kind of word? The good kind, Harold smiled. I received 3 calls this morning from other retail business owners, asking if you'd be willing to consult on similar programs for their stores. Madison blinked in surprise. Really? Completely serious. And there's more. The Charlotte Business Journal wants to do a feature on our innovative approach to customer service and diversity training. Thomas perked up. You guys are going to be famous. It's not about fame, Madison corrected gently, though she couldn't hide her excitement. It's about impact. If other businesses implement similar programs, it means more people will be treated with dignity and respect when they shop. That afternoon, Madison received a call she hadn't expected. Madison? This is Maria Santos. Miss Santos, how can I help you? Actually, I was hoping I could help you. I'm the HR director for a large hospital network here in Charlotte. After seeing what you accomplished at Magnolia & Co., my CEO would like to meet with you about adapting your program for our healthcare environment. Madison sat down heavily. For hospitals, healthcare has enormous problems with implicit bias and unequal treatment of patients. What you created, this approach to changing mindsets through personal experience and reflection, is exactly what we need. After the call, Madison found herself contemplating possibilities she had never considered. What had begun as a consequence of her own discriminatory behavior was transforming into something much larger, a methodology that could have impact beyond the confines of a single retail store. That evening, she drove to Dolores Jordan's house for one of their regular conversations. Dolores welcomed her with her always warm smile and the tea that had become ritual in their meetings. You seem thoughtful tonight, Dolores observed as soon as they sat down. Madison told her about the day's developments, the potential consulting work, the media interest, the opportunity in the hospital system. And how do you feel about all of this? Dolores asked. Scared, Madison admitted. When I started this program, it was about redeeming myself for what I had done to you. Now it seems to be becoming something much bigger, and I don't know if I'm qualified for it. Dolores smiled. Dear, do you think qualifications come from diplomas or titles? No. Qualifications come from genuine experience and personal growth. You've been through both. You understand both the problem and the solution because you've lived both. Dolores leaned forward. May I tell you a story about Michael when he was young? Madison nodded. When Michael was in high school, he wasn't particularly talented at basketball. He was cut from the school team. He was devastated. But instead of giving up, he used that rejection as motivation to work harder than anyone else. I didn't know that. Few people do. But the point is this: your greatest qualifications come not from your natural successes, but from how you respond to failures and challenges. You were rejected by your own attitudes and used that as motivation to become a better person. Madison reflected on this. So you think I should accept these opportunities? I think you should follow your heart. But remember that helping one person change is wonderful. Helping entire systems change can transform thousands of lives. When Madison got home, she found a message on her answering machine from Michael Jordan. Madison, I heard about today's developments. I'm impressed, but not surprised. You took a difficult situation and transformed it into something positive. That's exactly the kind of leadership the world needs more of. His message continued. I want you to know that whatever support you need, financial, logistical, or simply advice is available. My foundation would be honored to partner in any expansion of this program. Madison sat in her kitchen, looking out the window at the city of Charlotte. 6 months ago, she was an arrogant store employee whose prejudices had nearly destroyed her career. Today, she was being invited to take a social transformation program to organizations throughout the city. The journey had been painful, humbling, and transformative, but it had resulted in something she never could have imagined: the ability to help other people avoid the mistakes she had made and find their own paths to growth. She picked up her phone and called Maria Santos back. Miss Santos? It's Madison. About our earlier conversation, I'd love to meet with your CEO. Wonderful. Tomorrow, if possible. There's a lot of work to be done, and I'm not going to waste any more time. After hanging up, Madison opened her laptop and began to write. Not a training program or professional presentation, but a reflection on the journey that had begun with a kind woman in a department store and was transforming into something that could touch lives throughout the community. It was a story about second chances, about the courage required to confront your own prejudices, and about the transformative power of treating every person you meet as if their worth were infinite. It was a story that was just beginning. The next morning, Madison woke up with a feeling she hadn't experienced in a long time: pure excitement about the future. Not excitement about personal success or professional recognition, but excitement about the possibility of making a difference in how people treat each other. She dressed carefully for the day, choosing clothes that were professional but not intimidating. She had learned that true authority doesn't come from how you dress or where you work, but from how you treat the people around you. When she arrived at the store, she found a surprise waiting for her. Thomas, Jennifer, and several other employees had arrived early and decorated her small office area with flowers and a banner that read, "Thank you for teaching us to see." "What is all this?" Madison asked, visibly moved. "It's our way of saying thank you," Jennifer explained. "You took a group of people who were stuck in old patterns and helped us become better versions of ourselves." Thomas stepped forward. "Madison, I want you to know that regardless of where your career takes you next, what you taught me will be part of who I am for the rest of my life." Madison looked around at these people who had become not just colleagues, but genuine friends, united by a shared commitment to treating others with dignity. "You all taught me something too," she said. "You taught me that change is possible when people are willing to do the work. Each of you chose to grow when you could have chosen to resist. As she looked at their faces, faces that now reflected genuineness, where once there had been guardedness, Madison realized that regardless of what opportunities lay ahead, this would always be where her real education began. This small group of retail workers had proven that transformation is possible, one person at a time, one interaction at a time, one choice at a time. And that was a lesson worth sharing with the world. 6 months after the training program had been officially reinstated, Madison found herself standing in the same place where it had all begun, next to the jewelry counter at Magnolia & Co. But today was different, very different. The store was filled with media representatives, Charlotte business leaders, and local dignitaries. The Charlotte Business Journal was documenting what they called the Magnolia Miracle, a customer service transformation that had become a national model for other businesses. But for Madison, the most significant moment wasn't when the mayor proclaimed the store Business of the Year, or when the Charlotte Chamber of Commerce announced that Madison's program would be replicated in 50 local businesses. It was when she saw Dolores Jordan enter through the front door, walking directly to the counter where it had all begun. Madison excused herself from the conversation she was having with a reporter and went to meet the woman who had changed her life. "Mrs. Jordan," she said, her voice slightly trembling with emotion. Dolores smiled with that same warmth she had shown even in the worst moments. "I wouldn't miss this for anything, dear. I wanted to see firsthand the transformation Michael has been talking about so much." Thomas, who had become the store's lead salesperson, approached them. Over recent months, he had transformed completely, not just in his sales practices, but in his fundamental understanding of customer service. "Mrs. Jordan," he said respectfully, "it's a pleasure to meet you. Madison told us how you started this journey for all of us." "Actually," Dolores replied, "it was your own hunger for growth that started this journey. I just provided the situation." As the official event continued, Madison discreetly observed the interactions around her. Jennifer was helping an elderly couple choose anniversary gifts, treating them with the same attention she would give any high-income customer. Marcus was patiently answering a young father's questions about baby products, without pressure or hurry. Most impressive was seeing a new employee, Sarah, hired 3 weeks ago, naturally applying the principles that had become part of the store's culture. She was helping a customer who clearly didn't have much money to spend, but treating her with absolute respect and genuine interest in finding something that fit her budget. "Madison," came a familiar voice behind her. She turned to see Michael Jordan approaching, impeccably dressed as always, but with a genuine smile that spoke of personal, not professional, pride. "Michael," she replied, still occasionally surprised by how easily he made her feel comfortable despite his fame and status. "I wanted you to know," he said, "that the program you developed is being studied by researchers at Duke University. They want to understand why it was so effective when so many other diversity programs fail." Madison shook her head. "It was effective because it was personal. It wasn't about politics or compliance. It was about recognizing our shared humanity." Michael nodded. "Exactly. And that's why it's being replicated. Harvard Business School wants to do a case study. The American Retail Federation wants you to give the keynote speech at their national conference." "That's overwhelming," Madison admitted. "It's deserved," Michael corrected. "But more importantly, it's necessary. The world needs more people willing to do the difficult work of examining their own prejudices and changing." As the day progressed, Madison found moments for individual conversations with each of her colleagues. The transformations she had witnessed were profound and lasting. These weren't superficial behavioral changes, but fundamental shifts in how these people saw and interacted with the world. Jennifer had begun volunteering at the community center where Madison had learned so much. Thomas was considering returning to school to study social psychology. Marcus had started mentoring young people in his neighborhood about professionalism and customer service. Each had found ways to take the lessons beyond the store's walls. At the end of the day, after the cameras had gone and the official speeches had ended, Madison found herself alone in the store with Harold Magnolia. "Do you have a moment?" Harold asked, gesturing toward his office. When they sat down, Harold opened a drawer and removed a folder. Madison, these are offers we've received for you over the past few weeks. Corporate consulting, university positions, opportunities with national non-profit organizations. Madison leafed through the documents, impressed by the scope and prestige of the opportunities being offered. Some of these are incredible, she said. They are. And you deserve every one of them. Harold paused. But I want to make my own offer. Madison looked up. I want you as Vice President of Organizational Culture for Magnolia & Co. Not just for our store, but for the whole company as we begin to expand. Competitive salary, equity in the company, and total autonomy to develop and implement programs like this. Madison looked at Harold in surprise. Mr. Magnolia. Mr. Magnolia. Harold, he corrected. And Madison, this offer isn't based on sentiment or loyalty. It's based on business reality. Since you implemented this program, our customer satisfaction has increased 40%. Our customer retention has increased 35%. And our revenue has grown 25%. You've made us a better company in every measurable way. Madison considered the offer. It was generous, meaningful, and would allow her to continue the work that had become her passion. May I have some time to think about it? Of course. But know that whatever you choose, you'll always have a home here. That evening, Madison drove to a place that had become special to her, the park, where she had taken Sophie, Rachel's daughter from the shelter, for a picnic a few weeks before. Rachel had gotten her own place and was rebuilding her life, but they had maintained contact. Madison sat on a bench, watching families enjoying the warm evening, and reflected on everything that had happened. A year ago, she was a fundamentally different person. Arrogant, judgmental, focused only on appearances and status. Today, she was someone who found genuine joy in helping others grow, in creating environments where all people felt valued. Her phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Dr. Williams, the cardiologist who had testified on her behalf. Saw you on the news tonight. Wanted you to know that your impact extends beyond what you might realize. Shared your story with my medical staff. And we're implementing similar awareness training. You're helping change healthcare too. More messages followed throughout the evening. From Rachel, thanking her for being a role model for Sophie. From Maria from the homeless center, telling her that several volunteers had been inspired by her story to examine their own biases. As Madison read each message, she realized that the true impact of her transformation wasn't in any single program or achievement. It was in the ripple effect, the countless small ways that choosing to change herself had influenced others to make their own choices for growth. When she finally drove home, Madison thought about the offer Harold had made. It was a wonderful opportunity, and one that honored the work she had done. But she also thought about the other opportunities, chances to take this work to a national scale, to influence policy and culture in ways that could affect millions of people. Whatever she decided, one thing was certain. The scared, defensive young woman who had treated Dolores Jordan so poorly was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood that true wealth came not from what you owned or where you worked, but from how you treated the people you encountered every day. As she unlocked her apartment door, Madison found a final envelope waiting for her. Inside was a handwritten note from Dolores. Dear Madison, watched you today and felt such pride not because of your achievements, but because of who you've become. You took a moment of failure and transformed it into a lifetime of purpose. That's what real strength looks like. Keep changing the world, one person at a time, with love and admiration. Dolores. Madison folded the note carefully and placed it in a frame on her dresser. Tomorrow, she would make her decision about the future, but tonight, she simply felt grateful for a journey that had taught her that the most important transformations happen not in boardrooms or conference halls, but in the quiet moments when we choose to see another person's humanity rather than our own assumptions. The woman who had once judged others by appearances now spent her days helping people see beyond surfaces, to the dignity and worth that lived in every human heart. It had been a remarkable transformation, and it was just the beginning. 2 years after the events that changed her life, Madison Parker stood before an audience of 500 business leaders at the National Diversity and Inclusion Conference in Chicago. She had chosen to build her own consulting firm, Transformative Cultures, which now worked with organizations across the country. But today was special. Today, she was presenting alongside Dolores Jordan, who had become honorary co-founder of the company and mentor to many of the programs they had developed together. 2 years ago, Madison began her presentation. I was exactly the type of person you're trying to reach with your diversity programs. I was smart, educated, professional, and completely unconscious of my own prejudices. She paused, looking at the audience of CEOs, HR directors, and diversity leaders. I didn't change because someone gave me a lecture or made me watch a training video. I changed because I was forced to confront the real impact of my prejudices on real people. And more importantly, because someone believed I was capable of growth. Madison gestured toward Dolores, who was seated in the front row. This is Dolores Jordan. She's the woman I treated poorly that day in the store. And she's the reason I'm here today. Thanks for watching. And while she's working, and next item 7Ds. And while she's the reason I'm here today. The audience turned to look at Dolores, who waved graciously. Mrs. Jordan could have chosen to despise me, sue me, or simply forget me. Instead, she chose to see potential where I only saw failure. She chose to invest in my capacity to change. Madison clicked to the next slide, which showed data from more than 100 organizations that had implemented the Magnolia model, as it had been dubbed. The results speak for themselves. 89% improvement in customer satisfaction among diverse demographic groups, 76% reduction in discrimination-related complaints, and 65% increase in retention of employees from minority groups. She clicked again, showing photos of teams from various organizations that had gone through the program. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. The real measure of success is in the individual lives that were transformed. Madison told the story of Thomas, who now ran his own customer service consulting business, of Jennifer, who had become HR director at a major corporation, of Marcus, who was finishing his MBA while continuing to mentor young people in his community. Each of these people made the choice to grow. Our role isn't to force change. It's to create the conditions where change becomes possible and desirable. When Madison finished her presentation, Dolores joined her on stage. May I add something? Dolores asked the audience. Please, Madison replied, passing her the microphone. You heard Madison talk about transformation and growth, Dolores began. But I want you to understand something important. The change didn't begin when my son Michael intervened. It began when Madison chose to listen to her own conscience that night after our encounter. Dolores looked directly at the audience. Every person in your organizations has that same conscience. Your task isn't to create guilt or shame, but to help people hear that inner voice that already knows what's right. After the presentation, Madison and Dolores were surrounded by business leaders wanting to implement similar programs. But the conversation that most impacted Madison was with a young executive named Patricia Rodriguez. Miss Parker, Patricia said nervously. May I speak with you privately? When they stepped away from the crowd, Patricia continued. I heard your story and I recognize something of myself. I think I've been the person who treats others poorly without realizing it. Madison saw in Patricia the same look she had seen in her own mirror 2 years before: confusion, shame, and hope mixed together. Tell me more, Madison said gently. I'm VP at a tech company. I rose quickly, and I always prided myself on being tough and direct. But lately I've noticed that people of color and women on my team seem hesitant around me. And yesterday, a colleague pulled me aside and said that my communication style makes people feel diminished. Patricia paused, clearly struggling. I don't want to be that person, but I don't know how to change. Madison smiled. seeing an opportunity to continue the cycle of transformation. Patricia, would you be interested in coming to Charlotte for some mentoring? We have a program specifically for high-potential leaders who want to develop more inclusive leadership styles. That would be wonderful. But may I ask, why would you help me? You don't know me, because someone helped me when I needed it most. And because I believe everyone deserves a chance to grow into their better self. Later that evening, Madison and Dolores sat in the hotel restaurant, reflecting on the day. You know, Dolores said, when I first met you that day in the store, I saw something special. Not in your actions, those were terrible, but in your reaction when I called you out. Most people would have become defensive or angry. You became thoughtful. I was terrified, Madison admitted. I suddenly saw myself clearly, and I didn't like what I saw. Exactly. That self-awareness, that willingness to sit with discomfort, that's where real change begins. Dolores sipped her tea. You know that Michael has been talking about running for local office. Madison looked up, surprised. Really? He's interested in education policy. Wants to bring this kind of transformational thinking to schools. Help kids learn these lessons before they develop harmful patterns. That would be incredible. He's asked me to consider being his campaign manager, Dolores said with a mischievous smile. Can you imagine? An elementary school teacher running a political campaign? Madison laughed. I think you'd be perfect. You've been changing hearts and minds your whole life. As they finished dinner, Madison thought about how far she'd come. Not just professionally, though, building a successful consulting firm had been rewarding, but personally. She had learned to find joy in helping others discover their capacity for growth. Her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Saw your presentation online. Proud to call you mentor. P.S. Closed a deal today with a major client who specifically hired us because of our reputation for treating everyone with respect. Another message came from Jennifer. Madison, just got promoted to director level. Told them during the interview that I learned my leadership philosophy from you. Keep changing the world. As Madison read each message, she felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal achievement. It was the satisfaction of knowing that her own transformation had created ripples that continued to spread, touching lives in ways she might never fully know. When she got back to her room, Madison opened her laptop and began writing in her journal a practice she'd maintained since the early days of her transformation. Tonight, she wrote about cycles of kindness, about how receiving grace had taught her to extend grace to others. She thought about Patricia, the young executive who reminded her so much of her former self. Tomorrow, she would begin creating a customized development program that could help Patricia avoid the mistakes Madison had made. As she finished writing, Madison realized that her story had become larger than just personal redemption. It had become proof that people could change, systems could improve, and that treating each other with dignity wasn't just nice, it was transformational. The scared, arrogant young woman who had once judged a customer by her simple clothes had become someone whose life's work was helping others see beyond appearances to the inherent worth in every human being. It had been a remarkable journey of growth, forgiveness, and purpose. And as she looked toward the future, Madison knew that the best chapters were still to be written not just in her own story, but in the countless stories of transformation that her work would help make possible. Change, she had learned, was always possible. One person at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time. And tomorrow, the work would continue. This transformation story shows that even in our lowest moments, when we confront our own prejudices and failings, there exists an opportunity for real growth. Madison Parker's journey from an arrogant employee to a leader in diversity and inclusion proves that genuine change is possible when we have the courage to face our own flaws and when other people believe in our capacity to grow. Dolores Jordan's legacy, choosing to respond to discrimination with grace and seeing potential where others saw only failure, created waves of transformation that touched hundreds of lives and changed an entire business community. Sometimes the deepest lessons come from the most humiliating moments. And sometimes, a single choice to treat someone with dignity can change the course of an entire life.